And I want some way to put it. Great pleasure to be here. I've been very excited about this big gathering. And is that all right? Yeah, and particularly feel privileged to be the keynote speaker today. Let me know if you can't hear anything. It was sex that taught me to think like a man. When I started working as one of Australia's first sex therapists back in the 1970s, my goal was very much to help women. I was really excited about the women's movement and keen to do what I could to help women achieve equality in the bedroom as elsewhere. Little did I know that wasn't going to be enough for many feminists. They were determined to grind men into the dirt. I became the person that everybody talked to about sex. And in the process, I learned a lot about what it's like to be on the other side of the fence. Once I was speaking to a group of men about the problem women have saying no to sex. Now, that may seem a very alien concept to you these days, but this was the 70s. We were coming out of a period when, men had conjugal rights. Women still saw themselves as having a wifely duty, and though many of them were very reluctant to knock back their husbands. Anyway, there was an audience of men I was talking to them about this and the problem women had with this, and I asked them if they'd ever had trouble saying no to sex. If I ever said no, my penis would beat me to death, said one young man. Which was pretty funny at the time, but it was really indicative to me of the problem of the issue of relentless male sexual desire. Boy, have things changed. If we look back over the last 40 years, we've gone from a period where women were expected to lie back and think of England and suffer through unwanted sex, to today where women feel absolutely entitled to shut up shop if they're not interested. And the change all started back in the 1960s when the women movement started campaigning about marital rape. And there was no question that sexual violence had to stop. But something else was happening at the time. Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. And I'm sure you all know about his famous journey. What you may not know is when he got back in the lunar module, he made a strange little comment. He said, "Good luck, Mr. Gorski." And all the reporters asked him, "Who's this Gorski person?" And he wouldn't answer. And then after about 20 years, someone asked him again about this, and he said, "Oh, I can talk about that now." And he explained that the Gorskis were his next-door neighbours when he was growing up as a little boy in the Midwest town. And he was one day playing baseball with his mates, and the ball went over the fence, and he went to pick up the ball outside the Gorski's bedroom window. And he heard Mrs. Gorski yell at Mr. Gorski, "Sex! You want sex? You'll get sex when the kid next door walks on the moon." It's such a good story. And it's unfortunately only an urban myth. It's always doing the rounds of the internet. But it captures the shift that occurred at that time. And we now have a world who's full of Mrs. Gorskis. Most married men, most men in long-term relationships are spending their lives grovelling for sex or having sex doled out to them like meaty bites to a dog, as one man said. There's a frightening thing because there's evidence from all over the Western world of this desire gap between men and women increasing. If women lose interest in sex in a long-term marriage, it just doesn't happen. And I think that's an absolute tragedy for men because most men assume in their most intimate relationship that will include one of life's great pleasures, and yet they live their lives in a state of constant sexual rejection. We're not even allowed to talk about this vital issue. 8 years ago, I wrote a book called The Sex Diaries, which is based on the idea of getting couples, I had 98 couples, talking about how they negotiate sex in their marriages. And what came through so strikingly was this howl of misery from men. Men talking about what it's like living with that rejection. One man wrote to me and he said he got so sick of dealing with rejection that he said to his wife, okay, that's Nick. He was the one who always had to initiate. And he said, okay, next time we have sex, you're going to initiate. That was 8 years ago, and they haven't had sex since. And I really delved into what was going on here. I mean, there's such a gap between men and women around the whole issue of why is sex important in a relationship. And so many women said to me, oh, for goodness sake, it's just sex, go run around the Oval or have a cold shower. They didn't understand why it was so important to men. And one of the fascinating things I could do was take ideas that were coming through from my diarists and try them out on another group. So a lot of the women were talking about the whole issue of being groped. They'd say, I like being cuddled, I like having his arm around me, but inevitably the hand ends up on the breast or the bottom and it turns into a grope, and I hate being groped. So I had all these quotes about the grope, and I sent them to a group of my men and said, tell me about... Oh, one woman said to me, a lovely story, one woman said, every time we spoon, I get forked. Anyway, so I sent all these quotes about the grope to some of my men, and I said, tell me about this. Why do you do it if she says she hates it? And one man wrote back to me and he said, look, I know she doesn't like it. I know I'm going to get into trouble, but it's me saying, hello, here I am. I still love you. I still want you. Where has she gone, the lover I married? And it broke my heart. I mean, so many people have said to me they were shocked reading the stories from men about what this is like for them. But I got into enormous trouble. I wasn't suggesting that women give in to men. That's not what it's all about. But I made a very strong statement about the fact that the low desire partner, whether it's a male or a female, needs to consider the impact of that constant rejection on their partner. And I talked about really important research that's come through about women that show that many women, much to our surprise, there are many women who actually can experience sexual pleasure without prior desire. If you put the canoe in the water and start paddling, and you're with a man who knows how to make love to you properly, and you can get your head in the right place and anticipate sexual pleasure, there's a lot of women who can really enjoy sex without desire. And I talked about this in my book. Even that was enough to suggest, to have me totally hated by the Twitter sphere, where I'm now promoted as a rape cheerleader. But the point is that I'm using this example of sex, and it's not just about sex. This illustrates an extraordinary shift in the balance of power in marriages and relationships that's occurred over the last 40 years. A far broader change that I think is making men's lives an enormous misery. We live at a time when women's needs and women's wants are given endless priority over men. I mean, if I walked through the streets of Australia and said, what's missing from your relationships, a lot of men would be saying more sex. And yet that absolutely never makes it on the public agenda, let alone the private agenda. A lot of men say they can't even talk to their partners about this. We face a constant stream of propaganda demonising men and praising women. Just look at the issue of who works harder in the home. In Australia, as elsewhere, we see these endless news reports of who's doing what in the home, the housework issue. And you always have these headlines about how hard women work and how men are just sitting there being lazy and letting us have to do anything. And they totally leave out the vital equation, which is the total hours worked when you add paid and unpaid work, which has been absolutely level in Australia for decades, and it is never mentioned. Our Bureau of Statistics never releases press what do they call it? Press things, you know what I mean? Press releases, that's the word I'm thinking of, about total work. They only ever talk about housework, and they only present it as an issue where we criticise men. Australian men actually average twice as many working hours as Australian women do. And of course their working hours dramatically increase when women drop out of the workforce to have children or drop back to part-time work. No one ever talks about that. No one ever talks about men's shrinking leisure time. There's been a fascinating thing, a really steep drop in the number of men's leisure time out of the home. You know, we once had pubs on every corner in Australia, and very few men dare drop into the pub on the way home these days. Men are always in trouble for not doing enough, for not being there to help their partners. No more spending the weekend tinkering with a car or playing golf. No thanks to men ever for working so hard. Men's working hours are endlessly increasing, and yet we never hear that discussed, let alone acknowledged. I was once in my corporate wife days, I was at a dinner party with a whole bunch of couples, and the men were paying the bill, and one of the women said, "Oh, we must thank our husbands for working so hard to provide this lovely dinner for us." And another woman sitting there said, "I work hard too." It was just classic, the reaction to that from the group of women that were there. They were just astonished that a woman would thank her husband for working so hard. Men are on a very short leash indeed, always in trouble for not doing enough. One of the things that really fascinates me is I've looked at how couples choose what sport their sons play. And we've seen a real decline in Australia in the number of boys playing rugby. And I've walked around soccer fields on a Saturday morning interviewing the dads, the big beefy blokes, and asking them, "Did you ever play rugby?" "Oh, sure, I played rugby." "Oh, your son's playing soccer, why is that?" "Oh, Mum thinks it's better. Your mum's worried about him being injured." An extraordinary thing. I mean, that men are not even allowed to choose what sport their sons play. What's changed, of course, is women are no longer dependent, and women have gained the power to walk out of relationships where they're not happy. And, of course, they're doing so in droves. Karen Strawn gave a wonderful talk this week, on Wednesday, to the Sydney Institute about the whole issue of why men might be nervous of marriage these days. And she talked about those three dreaded words, "I'm not happy." You can see that if you Google the Sydney Institute, there's a podcast there. It was a brilliant talk. But the point is that, of course, it's very hard for any man to come up to women's extraordinarily high expectations of what they want in a relationship these days. And men know they risk everything if she decides she's had enough. Men are on the back foot, and they know it. I once had this amazing experience. I was doing a radio program around the whole issue of how marriages survive and the discovery of an affair, and asked people to call in about that. And I had this call from a woman, and she rang me privately after the radio program, and she was telling me about early in their marriage, he'd had an affair when she was pregnant, and she was outraged when she discovered that, and she went and started this relationship with her neighbour, had this affair with a neighbour, sort of as retaliation. And then, much to my surprise, she put her husband on to talk to me as well. And I had no idea whether anyway, she told me that affair was still going on. 20 years later, it was still happening. And I'm talking to this man not knowing whether he knew that. And I'm having this conversation, and he tells me all about that and how sorry he felt about the affair. And yes, she had an affair with a neighbour, but luckily it was all over in a few weeks. And I had this nerve-wracking conversation, not wanting to spill the beans, where he talked about his marriage, talked about how grateful he was that they got through that bad time. And there was just watching his children grow up and so on, no question in my mind that he was turning a blind eye, because he was dependent on his relationship. He knew what he had to lose if he made a big fuss about that. And, think about that. Women used to have to turn a blind eye to their husbands' affairs because they were powerless, they had nowhere to go if they were unhappy. And now I think that's what's happening to men. The funny thing is, of course, men are always in trouble over sex as well. Men are in trouble for not keeping their trousers zipped, for groping or harassing women. They're caught out looking at pornography or gazing at women in the wrong way. And we never hear about men's extraordinary sexual restraint. Men have up to 20 times the level of testosterone that women do, yet most manage to keep a lid on their desires and remain faithful in largely sexless marriages. When my book came out, an Argentinian journalist rang me and said, "I can't believe these Australian men. I mean, if our men were in relationships where they're getting so little sex, they'd have a mistress, they'd leave the marriage. So just no way would they stay put." It's an interesting shift that's occurring there. And in the middle of all this, we have our current cultural dialogue encouraging women, positively encouraging women to flaunt their sexual power over men. You know, we are allowed to dress any way we like. We can dress in the most provocative ways and flaunt our bodies, but if the wrong man is caught out looking at the sexual display, he's in trouble. There's a fascinating book called The Testosterone Files, and it's written by a feminist writer, a young female feminist, who has a sex change, becomes a man. And when, as a male, his name is Max Valero, talks about this extraordinary impact on him of the testosterone he was receiving, and how he couldn't walk past a newsagent without gazing at all these, sexy photos in magazines and so on. But he also talks about watching the women's chat shows where sheepish male guests are paraded before audiences who are, porn addicts or womanizers, and he sees the finger wagging and the women with their pursed lips, and he's shocked by women's ready display of moral superiority. And we see that everywhere. Puritanical women judging men and putting a lid on men's exuberant sexual natures. Luckily, there are women like me who object to what's going on here. There are some women who actually enjoy being forked. But turning to broader issues, there's, of course, the so-called wage gap, which is being relentlessly used to support affirmative action, promoting women's progress in the workforce, and, of course, ignoring the numerous studies showing that most of that gap is attributable to women's work lifestyle choices, to preferred areas of employment, and women's inability to promote themselves effectively when it comes to promotion and so on. There's differences in health care. When a woman loses a breast through mastectomy, we all have been taught to understand what a blow it is to her femininity. There's endless support systems in place for her, government money for breast reconstruction and prostheses. But a man who loses the sexual functioning of his penis after prostate cancer surgery, which I would argue is very much the equivalent issue in terms of the blow to his masculinity, he doesn't get a single cent of government money to the cost of penile rehabilitation. I've been campaigning for years about this, and I just don't understand why men aren't marching in the streets for the right to an erect penis. Look at education. As Christina Hoff Sommers has so eloquently shown, what started out as a sensible push for removing barriers to women's school achievement has morphed into an education system which plays entirely to female strengths. I was writing about this back in the 1990s when parents started to speak out about what was happening in schools. Boys filling the remedial classes, falling behind, dropping out of schools and universities. And we had this parliamentary inquiry and all these new policies were put into place, most of which were dropped when the coalition lost power. One of my most fascinating letters I've ever received starts off at slagging at my fat poodle face, goes on to commiserate with my daughter about the shame of having such a mother, and concludes that women today are far beyond needing equality. They need compensation for 2,000 years of being repressed, mutilated, enslaved, raped, and treated like inferiors. And that's why we have 60% of women graduates in our universities, and yet still university administrators are beavering away trying to encourage more women into the very few courses where women don't dominate, and trying to increase the number of women professors and so on. Our universities are an increasingly hostile climate for men. As the wonderful Janice Fiamengo will unfortunately won't be telling you, one of the sad things about this conference is we're not going to be able to use the proposed Skype talks from Janice. If you don't know her, go and Google Fiamengo Files. She's a brilliant advocate for men, for males, and a critic of what's happening in universities, and the way that universities have become an increasingly anti-male culture. Just look what's happening in Australia. We're just seeing this amazing campaign unfolding in front of our eyes, which is all about this so-called rape culture on campus. we've seen what happened in America, a totally cooked up survey claiming that 73% of students have experienced some sort of unwanted sexual behaviour. That was produced by a union of students, all self-reported, including everything from having someone look at you in the wrong way to, supposed rape. We have our Human Rights Commission then leapt into action, promising $1 million to repeat this sort of self-selected survey. And of course, when those results come out, we're then going to have enormous pressure on our universities to introduce a sort of crazy yes means yes sexual consent regulations now in place in American campuses, which are ruining the lives of many young men and young males finding themselves in front of kangaroo court type tribunals which deny any man the chance of producing the evidence he needs to defend himself. Across the world, the most extraordinary changes are occurring in the rule of law, as you're going to hear from many speakers over this weekend. The basic assumptions about being innocent until proven guilty are totally discarded in order to shaft men. Ken Aronson tomorrow is going to talk about our deep south, Victoria, which has become one of the most anti-bail legal jurisdictions in the world. But what I've been talking about so far generally is pretty trivial compared to the devastation occurring in men's lives as a result of our increasingly biased family and criminal law systems, where false accusations of violence and sexual abuse are being used to tilt the system firmly in favour of women. Women who choose to be vengeful and destroy their ex-husbands, ex-partners, with the lawyers egging them on. I first started writing about family law back in the 1980s. I'd given up sex, professionally speaking, and after about 10 years, I really had enough of writing about the joys of oral love. So I delved out into other areas and started writing about family law. Much to my surprise, one day I received a letter from a judge. He was retiring from the family court and he said, "You're quite right, we've made a huge mistake. We've given too much power to the custodial parent," which of course was almost always women, "and that power is almost often abused." And he talked to me about how women had absolute licence to move wherever they liked, to totally lock men out of their children's lives and so on. And I spent over 2 decades focusing a lot on this issue. And I ended up being appointed by John Howard's government onto various government committees designed to reform family law. And that led to some real breakthroughs, such as the presumption of shared parental responsibility and a new child support formula, which at least made some attempt, however feeble, to account for the costs of the non-custodial parent. And many of those changes have been wound back after that government lost power. So it was a really interesting experience for me being on those government committees. I was there essentially representing men because the Femocrats who are running the show insisted on appointing men to the committees who didn't do their side much favours. And Howard's government sort of snuck me in to try to even things up a bit. The problem is what we had are these enormously powerful women's lobby groups with, attracting outstanding people. And up against them were, there were a lot of well-educated professional men who often shunned involvement with the men's groups. And so they fight individual battles involving highly paid lawyers. And to me, this is one of the key issues that bothers me about the whole men's rights movement, the fact that most well-educated, powerful men are really reluctant to associate themselves with a group of men that they see somehow as losers. I was once on one of these committees and a really senior bureaucrat took me aside and he said, "Look, I never believed all this stuff about men being so poorly treated in the family court until it happened to me." And he explained it one day. He came home, his wife had decided to end the marriage without telling him this was going to happen. Locks were changed on his house. He walked in, tried to get into the house, found himself arrested by the police, AVO, hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees in order to try to get to see his children, and so it went on. And he said he just would never have believed it. And that is true of so many men. And it's true of so many men we need on our side. I spent half my life fighting with powerful men, including my sons, trying to get them to see what's happening under their noses. And they don't know until it happens to them. Classic example of this. Now, my day job is actually now online dating coaching. So if you want to help me, find me clients for my online dating, which is being totally neglected at the moment, which is a wonderful job. It's light relief from all this stuff. But one of the fascinating things I find with my older female clients is they kept coming to me and said, by professional women, well-educated women, they say, all the men we meet are broke. And I then went out and did some research, and I talked to the ABS, our Bureau of Statistics, about the figures, and much to my surprise, which is something we never hear, of course, is I discovered that Australian divorced men and women if you look at Australian divorced men and women in their 50s, the women are much better off than the men, generally. Women are more likely to have had the house. If a divorce occurred, say, 10 years ago, the man would have got the super, and that was really hit by the financial crisis. The divorce settlement is based on current earnings and potential future earnings, and somehow our court believes that a 50-year-old guy or a 55-year-old guy is capable of, in a big job, is capable of keeping on earning that amount. And of course, he's very vulnerable when it comes to being downsizing and losing his job. I can't tell you, when I was online dating, the number of lovely men I met who were broke, who were 10 years ago were living in some fancy house in some nice suburb with 2 cars and whatever, and now they're renting and struggling. They're consultants. There's so many consultants online, meaning that they're really struggling to find employment of any sort. Now, going back to my family court committees, the point I'm making about that is how uneven the battle is. We had hundreds of submissions from individual men, and some of them were very impressive and well written, but they were up against these sleek professional presentations from the powerful women's groups. It was like mosquitoes throwing themselves at a huge mozzie zapper. And the women were winning every round. And even the minor victories we had at that time were easily wound back. The outstanding example of this is the famous Mackintosh saga. Now, some of you will know about this. Jennifer Mackintosh is a Victorian psychologist who was the lead author in a hugely influential study which concluded that any regular overnight care by fathers was damaging to infants and toddlers. She was appointed, after the Howard government lost power, she was chosen by the new Labor government to do research into these preschoolers, or overnight care of these preschoolers. And she already had a reputation for speaking out against shared parenting. So she was deliberately chosen to lead this study. And the research that came out and the position she took in promoting this research across the world led to hundreds of thousands of men losing any opportunity of being proper parents to their very young children. Men's groups in Israel threatened to sue her after she came to the country campaigning against shared parenting. In Australia, if a lawyer went to court and on behalf of a man trying to get care of one of these very young kids, they used to joke they'd been Mackintoshed because her research was always used to deny them that contact. And then came the game changer. Richard Warshak, many of you will know, a psychiatry professor in America who's an international authority on parental alienation. He brought together 110 world experts on issues relating to children, really substantial people, and they signed up to a consensus report which addressed the Mackintosh research. They concluded that that research position was deeply flawed and that the researchers had cherry-picked and exaggerated their results and drawn unwarranted conclusions from their data. And they also, of course, brought together all the research showing that children are likely to do much better if they have regular overnight care with both parents, and that if you deprive kids of that care, it really interferes with the developing relationship between children and their fathers. There's also another paper came out at the same time from Linda Nielsen, who's a professor at Wake Forest University in America, and she used the McIntosh research as an example of what she calls woozling, which is the process of misrepresenting and disseminating data in a way that misleads the public and policymakers. I mean, she had a 17-page analysis, a critique of the McIntosh research, and concluded it should never have been used to influence family law or drive social policy. Now, I wrote about this at the time, which was a hair-raising period, because McIntosh was threatening everybody, me, the paper, everybody, with lawsuits if we talked about the Warshak article. And amazingly, The Age stuck by me and they published. And after publication, I heard from hundreds of fathers who'd been McIntosh and were struggling to establish meaningful relationships with their kids after being really virtually excluded from their lives. What was just farcical about this is everybody knows those kids were having overnights with everybody under the sun. Auntie, grandma, you know, dubious boyfriends who were in the mother's lives, and the only person who was being excluded was the fathers. It was just farcical. This was an enormous story. I mean, here was an Australian researcher caught out lying about what the data actually showed. And, you know, here's someone who'd influenced courts across the world, and she was being exposed by these really eminent people. I spoke about this on radio and television across Australia. Of course, our taxpayer-funded ABC, none of the major programs would even touch it. The Warshak report was translated into 18 languages and is influencing the way courts are dealing with this issue across the world. But boy, did that woman cause a lot of damage. And even McIntosh eventually was forced to change her position. Some of her colleagues leant on her, and she has a slightly more nuanced approach now. But she claims she never actually said that she never actually promoted a ban on all overnights for preschoolers. And I have published the data showing she said exactly that. But who needs McIntosh when women have been handed an even more powerful weapon? It's gobsmacking watching the growth in the use of false accusations of domestic violence or sexual abuse to gain leverage in family court situations. I receive hundreds of letters, have watched this happen to so many men I know. You're going to hear from Augusto Zimmerman, who is this courageous West Australian Law Reform Commissioner, who's been fighting a mighty, very lonely battle against the changes that are occurring in Western Australia over this issue. To me, nothing better illustrates the power of the feminist lobby in this country and across the Western world than the extraordinary success of the domestic violence lobby. As Erin Pizzey would tell you, back in the 1970s, the feminists seized on domestic violence as a brilliant means of generating support and attracting funding at a time when the influence of the women's movement was starting to wane. Here's the ultimate motherhood issue, the one cause no one dare challenge, because at its heart is a very basic truth. There have always been women and children whose lives have been ruined by being controlled by violent men. These women need our protection. No one would question or deny the importance of stopping this from happening. But you have to sit back and wonder at how effectively this has morphed into this almighty industry, employing vast numbers of women across the world whose major goal is to promote misinformation about domestic violence and present it as a gender issue linked to misogyny and patriarchy. There are women everywhere working to suppress thousands of peer-reviewed research papers which show that most family violence is two-way violence that involving women as well as men, and revealing the complexity of this social problem and its proven links to mental health issues, drug and alcohol abuse, and poverty, etc. These are the 40 years of lies about domestic violence that Erin Pizzey has been fighting against. I spent 6 months trying to put together a paper nailing the statistics on domestic violence. And it's really hard because most of the researchers here as elsewhere are very nervous of being quoted about this subject. And it's not surprising because researchers in America have lost their funding, they've lost tenure, they've not allowed to speak at conferences. It's a real risk for an academic to speak out over this issue. Luckily enough, I could draw on Mark Latham's success in digging out the one statistic that really matters, that an astonishingly small 1.06% of women in Australia experience physical violence in any year in Australia. That tiny figure is always buried in statistics that are designed to inflate what's happening by, for instance, talking about lifetime experiences of violence, as if something that happened 40, 50, 60 years ago is relevant to what's happening today. I really must pay tribute to Greg Anderson, who runs the wonderful website 1 in 3, and he's out there every day trying to correct the misinformation that's out there around domestic violence. And he helped me try to get the information from the government bodies, working out what questions to ask them. You know, he's helping David Leyonhjelm, I mentioned at the press conference yesterday, the senator who's asking questions of our bureaucracies about how they are misrepresenting that issue. Just before I was about to publish my article, I came across this fantastic story which sort of says it all. It was about a Swedish politician called Eva Solberg, who'd just been presented with her government's latest strategy for combating domestic violence. And of course, like similar reports across the world, this strategy assumed that the only way to tackle domestic violence is through teaching misogynist men and boys to behave themselves. She wrote an article in which she spat the dummy. She took issue with her government's tired gendered analysis. She said, "We know through extensive experience and practice that attempts to solve this problem through this kind of analysis have failed. And they failed precisely because violence is not and never has been a gender issue," she said. And she talks about this vast body of research, the Partner Abuse State of Knowledge Project, which summarises 1,700 meta-analysis on this issue. We must recognise the fact that domestic violence, at least half its occurrence, is carried out by female perpetrators. The really important point she makes is that domestic violence is an inherited problem. Children learn from watching both their parents. To know this and to continue to ignore the damage done to children who are subjected to violence is a huge social betrayal, she said. To me, children are the key. No one cares about men, no one cares about male victims, sadly. But what we must do is get the message that we are betraying children by denying the experience of children in violent homes. Just as once we ignored what was happening to children who were being sexually abused, we didn't hear what they were trying to tell us, we are refusing to listen to children when they say, I'm living in this violent home and mummy and daddy are behaving in this way, are making me afraid of what's going on. And when it's just mummy, no one hears what the children say. This huge social betrayal rolls on. The effrontery of this industry is truly remarkable. In Australia, we have a program called Australian Story. It focuses on one individual's life. And in one program last year, amazing program, it featured Australia's first Minister for the Prevention of Family Violence, Fiona Richardson. And she was talking about her own family history. The whole program focused on her dad, who got violent when he had too much to drink. But in passing, about 1 minute in this program was spent mentioning the fact that her mother had a violent mother. So the grandmother was violent. And not only was she violent, but Richardson's mother was pushed by the grandmother into having sex with one of the grandmother's own boyfriends when she was 14. Now, this was just mentioned 2 minutes on this issue, while the whole program was battering this violent dad. And it's gobsmacking to me. how the media had the effrontery to ignore a story where if the genders had been reversed, this would have been front page news, wouldn't it? The role of the media in misrepresenting this issue is just shocking. Okay, in Australia we have a woman killed in family-related violence every 6 days. Now, the equivalent figure for men, of course, is every 10 days, and no one ever mentions that. But that figure once every 6 days wasn't good enough for one of the journalist lecturers, a woman who works, called Jenna Price, who works at UTS in Sydney, and she and her cronies decided to cook up the figures by funding a Facebook page called Destroy the Joint, which publishes cumulative figures of the number of women killed each year, gathered from media reports. So they're bringing together data designed to really inflate the official figures of partner homicides by including homicides of any sort. And the classic was last year. They had a man, a palliative care doctor, who'd obviously euthanized his 88-year-old mother. That was included in the domestic violence figures for the last year. The Destroy the Joint website is shameless. They say that's perfectly reasonable to include that because they say we believe all violent deaths targeted against women are a result of societal misogyny. So what we have is the woman teaching other journalists, students, to ignore official statistics, to use any cooked up data you like. And it's actually working. We have Australia's probably best known current affairs program is the 7:30 report. And last year, one of the segments on many segments on domestic violence was introduced by Lee Sales, saying two Australian women each year are killed by people they know well, husbands, fathers, partners. That too, of course, came from the Destroy the Joint website. Not once a week, not one a week, 2 a week. And gobsmacking, our Prime Minister also used that 2 women a week figure. So it goes on. And the role of the media, as we saw with poor Cassie on the project yesterday, is one of the key issues in capturing and distorting our cultural dialogue. And they have to be taken on. But enough of that. I just want to briefly talk about what we can do in terms of acting around this. I receive so many letters from men complaining about this situation, but nothing is going to change unless we all get active in doing something about changing this cultural dialogue about which is promoting the demonisation of men, changing the laws that are destroying the lives of so many men, stopping the takeover of our universities by anti-male rules and regulations, taking on the domestic violence industry and working to promote an end to all family violence. The list is endless and it's going to take enormous energy and commitment from lots of people, including many women. And I think women are key for various reasons. As Karen Strawn always says, it's, no woman is going to be accused of being some sort of loser bloke who can't get laid. It's much easier for us women to get out there and talk on behalf of men. We are more likely to be heard. That's why the honey badgers are so important. For every man who writes to me, I also get a lot of women writings, mothers of sons who are watching what's happening to them in the schools, mothers, women who have their brothers, their uncles, their men they love in their lives, and watching what's happening to them in the family court situation, watching men who are committing suicide and so on. And that, of course, is why Cassie Jay's wonderful movie is so important. I'm getting all emotional. To me, it was extraordinary. Even before I saw that movie, I was ropeable at the fact that this tiny minority group could decide what Australians are allowed to see. So I was out there trying to do something about it before I even saw it. And when I saw it, I was just blown away because it captures so many of the issues I've been fighting for so many years. And to me, the red pill should be the game changer. This is our opportunity in the best possible way to get the message out and get people to rethink this issue. But to me, we have to get this issue we have to get people bums on seats. We need to get people into the movie theatres. It's not good enough to watch on a video in the privacy of your house. If we want to take on these women who are trying to control what we're allowed to see in Australia, we have to go along to the cinemas. We have to prove to the cinema owners that we want to see this movie. That's why I've been organising through this organisation called Fan Force for people to put on screenings across the country. And it's been fantastic. We've had wonderful people, lots of women putting on screenings. You're going to hear from some of them here this weekend, like Ray Bonney, who works mainly, she's a mental health advocate who works mainly with blue-collar men and knows this issue inside out. But we've all found it's an enormous amount of work to get men into the movie theatres. And I find that so frustrating, because men are embarrassed to come along on their own to a cinema. They're nervous of being seen associated with this issue. They won't come in groups of men in case, they're seen as sissy in some way. And they're not allowed to come if their partners won't let them. I mean, come on, guys, it really annoys me that we've had a whole bunch of screenings where people volunteered to put on to host a screening in their area, and they sold 3 tickets and it didn't happen. It's not good enough. We really need to get active. This year we have to take on White Ribbon. I hope all of you know about White Ribbon. This is an organisation that is designed to encourage men to come on board and stand up against violence against women. And they are appalling in the way they misrepresent this whole issue. They have been caught out fudging data, totally lying about what research shows. They, of course, recruit lovely men who think they're doing the right thing, sports stars, you name it, well-known men in our community to be ambassadors, who think they're going to get brownie points for standing up against violence against women. And good for them. I mean, it is an important cause. We need to get to those guys and talk to those men and say, you are not happening the overall situation that's threatening so many children in violent families. You need to convince your organisation that we need to stop all violence, not just rely on the violence involving men. We've got to get into the schools. It is abominable that they are recruiting little kids and telling little boys that you are violent and you have to denounce your violence, while little girls sit there and totally bewildered at what's going on. You need to get parents involved in going into the schools and say, we don't want our children taught this rubbish. We need to support the men who are in workplaces. I hear from them all the time. Workplaces where they're being required to attend compulsory propaganda courses run by White Ribbon. I have men everywhere trying to stand up against this in their organisation, and it's really dangerous. We're producing documentation to give them. We're helping them plan strategy. If anyone would like to help me with this, it'd be really good, because I'm worried about guys losing their job in that situation, but I absolutely commend them for their courage in taking on the organisations who are falling for this rubbish. We need to work on our politicians. I mean, Malcolm Turnbull is clearly convinced that this is a vote winner to talk constantly about respect for women, to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on a really distorted domestic violence campaign. He believes that because no one is telling him that it's putting people off. And we can all put a lot of pressure on politicians to say, enough, we need the truth. We need social policies based on evidence, not on misinformation. We need to look at what's happening in the professions. Professions across the country have been captured by misleading information and by the domestic violence industry. My own profession, which is clinical psychology, has the psychologists have a policy on overnight care of infants still on their website, which was written by Jennifer McIntosh. All of the professional people in this room should be talking to the organisations you belong to. I know there's a doctor, I think he's here, who is constantly bombarding the College of GPs saying, why do you keep sending me this information about looking after female victims of domestic violence? Why don't you ever give us any advice on helping male victims? So that the whole issue of how do we change the dialogue within our professional organisations. Relationship counselling is a classic. I can't tell you how many of my poor men who were in sexless marriages had gone along to a relationship counsellor to try to talk something about what this was like, living with constant sexual rejection. And of course the female counsellor sides with his wife and they end up talking about housework. And that's what happens. I mean, the issue of relationship counselling is a major issue, and the fact that it is so anti-male in many cases. Universities, as I've said, we need to help the university administrators, the academics, the members of council. We need to get to them and say, stand up to this campaign that is underway already, which is designed to promote this idea of a rape culture on campuses. One of the things I want to do is tackle this women's studies programs, which are the source of a lot of the antagonism toward, the anger in young women about their lot. And to me, that's what came out in Cassie's interview with the project. There are a lot of young women who've been through university who have been captured by this nonsense being taught in the women's studies program, and they believe it, and that's their view of the world, that women are badly done by, that men have no problems, that we live in a patriarchy and so on. I'm trying to get people, if you know anyone to help me, I'm trying to get people to film what is being taught in our women's studies courses around Australia and name and shame the lecturers. So if anyone would like to help with that, that's good. We need to really engage with the media, to call them out when they're using misleading information, to put comments online, to write to editors, to write to producers of programs. You all should be writing to the producer of the project about the fact that they set Cassie up yesterday with this distorted situation and cut her answer into shreds. No point being abusive. I don't think there's any point in the feminism is cancer t-shirts and the abusive comments online. They don't do our cause any good whatsoever. We need to create a new, fresh dialogue, and the real answer is going to be the social media. I've been involved with great pleasure with Mark Latham's new exercise, his new Facebook page where he's doing live streaming every week, sending out programs around a whole range of issues. But he's given me my little niche, which is all about men's issues, and it's very exciting. And now he's joining up with Rebel Media in Canada, so we've got to have a global presence and an opportunity to really address these issues. We're getting so much. He had 1.5 million people view that Facebook website in the first 4 weeks. This is the Trump phenomenon, of course, this huge population of people who feel their issues have been ignored over the last few decades. And one of those big groups, of course, as we found in America, were the white men. And here, Mark, I think, is perfectly placed to address some of the issues that I've always been so concerned about. So there's a lot to do, and I think this conference is a wonderful opportunity for us to all exchange notes and learn from each other. And I'm really pleased to be here to learn a lot from you and to try to encourage all of you, not just to talk about this stuff, but to do something about it. Thank you.
Hi, I was just wondering if you know of anything that could be done at like a grassroots level with like the police and the family law courts. So I know a lot of guys are like falsely accused of domestic violence, and they get intervention orders against them. So I wonder if you have any ideas of what can be done to like inform the police that sort of thing goes on, and also make the family law courts aware that there's a lot of like perjury and stuff. And not just to kind of take the woman's side of the story. Yeah.
I'll do the perjury first. I talked about the Howard government's reforms back in, when was it, the 80s, was it? I've lost track of time. But anyway, they introduced penalties for perjury in family court. And then they were, of course, as always, the violent card comes in, and people, the way these reforms get wound back is it always ends up as we need to protect vulnerable women. If we do any, if women are being penalised for lying about family court, then this will happen. It is just so circular the way these arguments are run. But it's to me, it's about trying to recruit powerful people to get on our side. People like Augusta Zimmerman. We need the family law academics. We need the people who can talk to influential people and try to once again work on reforms to politicians and so on. There are really knowledgeable lawyers in Australia who have a lot of data about how you do succeed in family court battles around this issue, and I think we probably need some sort of informal group of bringing those people together to share that knowledge. And I haven't begun to think about how we do that, but anyway, I need to start talking to other family lawyers about how we can start some sort of network around that issue.
Thank you, Bettina, for the presentation. I couldn't help but think during the early parts of your presentation about the stat of 20 times the testosterone in males, and then try and do a quick calculation of how much extra testosterone we've got in this room at the moment, and how many, well, we won't go down to the erect penises bit. But anyway, my question is, you mentioned a stat right at the beginning about double the work hours by men. Could you just elaborate on that a bit, and also compare that to the stat we always hear about, the wage gap, and how they connect?
Don't give me too many. My feeble elderly brain will lose. Let me just do one at a time. Just I want to quickly say the one exciting thing about being in this conference is there's no queue in the loo. Exciting. And I've never mind being in a room full of testosterone, so that's good too. Now I've already forgotten the last one. I don't want the wage gap is too complicated. Someone else can do that for me. I've written about that in the past, but not for a long time. Now, what was the other thing?
It was just about the stat of
the working
double
hours.
working hours.
Okay, so that is true. That is the figure. Men do, on average, twice as many hours. Because we have a lovely situation in Australia, which I think is commendable in terms of caring for children, that most Australian women drop out of the workforce altogether when they have babies and spend a considerable varying period, looking after those infants, and I think that's wonderful. But then lots of women never go back into full-time work in Australia, and that is what's amazing to me. If you listen to Karen Straughan's Sydney Institute lecture, she discusses this issue of the deal that men and women might have, and the fact that women feel absolutely entitled to make a unilateral decision to say, I never want to go back working full time. And the man has to cop it. And the man has to work longer and longer hours, even if he doesn't want to. And even if he says, let's move to a cheaper house so, I can still work at reasonable hours and be involved in caring for the kids. If his wife says, no, I don't want that, he's got no choice but to do the second job and to do whatever it takes to keep the whole ship afloat. Sometimes it is very much a mutual decision of the couple, but I'm totally shocked at how many women feel absolutely no obligation to work, to continue to provide contribute to the family income. I live, in a wonderful area of Sydney, surrounded by places, Pilates classes and yoga classes, and places where lots and lots of women, even women with children who are school age, spend their days, enjoying themselves, playing tennis, ladies who lunch, and the men work long hours. And then, of course, when the divorce happens, the man is done like a dinner because he's been the one who has not shown the same commitment to caring for his kids and doesn't have the same relationship in terms of knowledge about caring for those kids, and therefore he's very readily excluded from proper parental involvement with that child. But those figures have been around for years and years, this huge gap between the full-time work commitment of men many of whom have absolutely no choice about it because their wives are making decisions that they prefer. I'll just tell you one wonderful story. I once did an article on who gets the better deal in marriage. And it was really funny because I went to lots of men and women and said, who do you think gets a better deal in your marriage? And everybody, men and women, talked about housework. The women said, oh, God, I wish he'd help me. I wish he'd do more. He never... And the men said, she's going to say I don't do enough to help around the house, and that's probably right. And it was so hard to get the men to look at their lives and think about whether they actually did have a fair deal. And there was this wonderful couple I came across where he'd been, I don't know, an engineer or something, and he had to, was forced out of his job in his 50s, and he had to take early retirement. And he was having a wonderful time because he'd always wanted to be, I think he was a sculptor, so he was doing a bit of sculpting and he was doing community work. And his wife, who was a teacher, who'd expected by then to have dropped back to part-time work, she didn't want to work full-time all her life, was working full-time because she had to maintain the family income. And she was a wonderful woman, and she talked to me about ringing her husband up and saying, asking what he'd been doing in his day, and gritting her teeth when he said, oh, I had this wonderful time and I did this, went to lunch, and and here she was, committed to working full-time for another 10 years or so. And she said, I don't get it. I don't understand why men aren't resentful of the fact that they have the yoke firmly around their necks and they don't even see that they've got a bad deal. Because she was in the male situation, she really resented it. And you remember Betty Friedan, who wrote The Feminist Mystique, famous early feminist, all about, discovering then in the 1950s that women were taking Valium and so on because they were living these miserable lives. They were frustrated in their wifely role and so on. And she talked about women leading unexamined lives. And the fact that that was the problem. That's why we had all these consciousness rating groups designed to women to understand why they should be resentful of their situation. I've felt for a long time that a lot of men still lead unexamined lives. They haven't begun to look at their situation and realise it totally stinks.
Bettina, just a couple of things. One, a quick comment and then a question. Firstly, the quick comment. I know when I was in Black Ribbon Foundation, one thing came up about someone having to go to a white ribbon training session, it might have been our watch, and they'd been a domestic violence victim themselves. And I think what we came up with at the time was that making that battered man go to that workplace training session breached the Sex Discrimination Act because it was gendered, and it breached the Work Health and Safety Act because it was re-traumatising him. So that might be an angle to explore in future when men come up. The other thing is I've noticed that whenever the discussion comes up, it's always white men, you couldn't possibly know privilege. The group that I've always noticed, and I find it very ironic with intersectional feminists with this, the group they always ignore is people with disabilities. Because if you look at the statistics on suicide, workplace discrimination suits, etc., they're one of the most vulnerable groups in society. Why do you think that we have this blinder when it comes to people with disabilities who also happen to be straight, white and male, given that it proved to be an Achilles heel when Destroy the Joint ignored disabled women who'd been domestic violence victims, that it is an Achilles heel? Also, how do you think we can use that against feminists?
I can't cope.
Sorry.
Sorry,
that was the end of the question.
Okay. All right. Firstly on that legal argument, it's an interesting point. I do have people who are out there digging away who are using those sorts of arguments in their situation. I have one particular guy who's in a batterers group. He was, false accusation of domestic violence, sent for re-education to this, compulsory group for rehabilitation, of teaching him the error of his ways. And he's a formidable fighter, and he's digging around all those legal arguments. And he goes in there every week and fights with them. And they've finally thrown him out, and now he's in front of the magistrate because the magistrate says, well, you're required to go there. The group is saying we won't have him back. So it's a stalemate. It's a very good story. One day I'm going to try to find someone in the media to write it up. But, yeah, you're right. There are some legal arguments we should be using and we should be presenting to people in that sort of situation. Now, what was the second point? Elderly moment again.
Second point. That's better. Given the blind spot of intersectional feminists to people with disabilities,
Disability. Okay, that's right.
Yeah, how can we use that against feminists? Because it occurs to me that it is one massive bit of kryptonite, as Destroy the Joint, I think it was 2 years ago, goes with disabled bad women.
I don't know that people only think of women when it comes to people with disabilities. That's possibly, to me, one of the areas where this argument that having men involved delegitimises the cause is probably not right. I mean, when I hear disabilities being discussed, I hear as many male advocates on radio as I do females. I'm not quite sure about that. Anyway. Anything else? Someone else? Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Arndt. Wonderful talk. I was just wondering, a lot of the tactics that you advise us to use are appeals to women and children and trying to make our case in terms of benefits and costs which occur to women and children because of feminist policies, etc. I am asking, you seem to agree that no one cares about male victims in and of themselves, hence having to appeal to women and children's interests. Do you believe this is innate and impossible to fix? Because, for example, Alison Tiemann, who's present here, has repeatedly talked about maybe instead we should try and encourage a cultural change to seeing men as capable of moral patiency and women as capable of moral agency. So, in other words, that men can be victims too, as we can all be, since we all exist physically and thus things can happen to us. So I was wondering, do you think there is no hope for making arguments in terms of male victimization and suffering?
No, I wouldn't say that. I mean, I just think that using the children in the family violence issue argument is just an easy way in a sense, a way that maybe make some people, changing hearts and minds will get some people to think about it in a way they wouldn't have before. But I mean, obviously, I don't believe we should give up on trying to talk about what's happening to men and addressing the issue of male victims. I mean, that's what I spend half my life writing about, and I get an enormous response, and so does I write mainly about this for the Australian. They get a very big response from men and women whenever I write about it, and we just have to keep at it. And I just think it's appalling that men don't matter. Now, just so that you know what we're doing on the beach, it sounded a bit dubious the way Robert discovered it. I mean, this is a classic example that I'm doing a media event at lunchtime, which just highlighting that point in the sense of the classic argument about male suicide and the fact that we're going to have 6 men in body bags at the edge of the beach, and we're going to do an event for the press saying, if these were whales, this whole beach would be an uproar with people trying to save them. 6 men kill themselves every day in Australia and no one cares. But, I mean, I'm trying to make the point we should care, obviously. And we have to keep doing that. We have to keep saying, what is wrong with you? You mothers of sons, you daughters of men, you women who have loving men in your life, why don't you care about them? It's a very simple argument. 6 a day. Yeah. And you don't ever hear that, do you?
Hi, Bettina.
Can't see any. Yeah.
I had already started planning to look into exposing a bit of what goes on in feminist-controlled lectures in a university environment. So I'd be really interested to ask you about that. I might ask you about it after a little bit more privately. Just wanted to put that out there first of all, that I'm also interested in that. What I wanted to ask you about right now is my partner and I haven't started our family yet, but we're very much planning in advance. And I have a lot of concerns about what kind of world my sons are coming into. What kind of advice would you have for parents and people planning their family to prepare their sons, and what's your best strategies for raising them to get by in what's becoming a very anti-male world?
Really exciting news. I became a grandmother this morning. But actually, she's a girl, and so her life will be rosy. You know? No, but I don't believe that. I believe if it had been a son, he has just as much opportunity to look forward to a bright future. There are lots and lots of men, as we know, who manage to escape the issues that we are also concerned about here. There are lots of men living good lives. I don't want to be so pessimistic about that, and to encourage young women like you to be worried about your children. It's not true. We still live wonderful lives. We live in a very free country where men and women can really have a good time and grow up to be healthy individuals in loving relationships. Luckily, what we're talking about here it is applying to a bigger group, but hopefully your children and your grandchildren will manage to escape that. And the way you do is to encourage them to be knowledgeable about what's going on and to go into relationships with open eyes, but to be caring, to be very conscious of the dialogue in the world, and you educate children to understand that and respond appropriately to it.
Hi, Bettina.
Sorry, I can't see anything.
Yeah,
Go on.
I'm Elstan.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for an amazing talk. But I just wanted to say one thing. I'm involved on a little bit, and a lot of young men ask me about the issue that the lady spoke earlier about what advice you can give to men. And I say to them unequivocally, record. And you wouldn't believe how many emails I received where they said, thank you for doing that. Because it's one word, your word against her word. We all know what's going to happen. Mm-hmm. Now, I wanted to ask you a different question. Is what gives you the strength and the capacity to stand against all this establishment that is totally anti what you're trying to do? And what gives you the strength and the power to continue working when really, I'm sure you've got many, many times where you were totally drained emotionally?
Oh, I love it. The reason I got involved in sex in the 1970s was it was a taboo subject. And I'm like a moth to the flame. I can't resist things we're not allowed to talk about. And now the big issue you're not allowed to talk about is men. So I love men. I've always loved men, and I want to, I have a daughter and two sons. I want my sons to be in a fair world where they're treated appropriately. My daughter, I have no doubts she's going to reap the rewards of the feminist movement. But I want the boys to have the same opportunities. So I get hardly any negative feedback directly. I know they're all out there slagging off about me, but that's never bothered me. And the fat poodle face did get to me a bit. But most of the time it doesn't bother me at all. I mean, I'm also at the stage of my career where it doesn't matter what I do anymore. And I've been locked out of lots of sectors of the media, and I'm very grateful to Mark Latham for taking me on. And I see that, there are enormous opportunities opening up in the media, and I'm very excited to be on board at a time in my life when I can do anything, and I couldn't give a stuff who it bothers. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the amazing Bettina Arndt.